We see these business owners who are convinced that they have to grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they don't grow, they're dying. Then they grow beyond their capacity. And ultimately what happens is quality suffers, right? The quality of the delivery suffers. They're under way more stress and they can't perform their best. They can't make as good of decisions when they're under that much stress. And it always, always, always affects profitability. It may not affect revenue, but it always affects profitability.
Always affects profitability.
And I think sometimes the higher revenue hides the lower profitability for a long time if they're not paying attention to their numbers. Are you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tonya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. If you are someone who has followed business advice that everyone swears by, only to find yourself more exhausted, more stressed, and somehow further from the success that you were promised, today's episode is for you, because what Gwen and I are doing today is what I like to think Gwen does especially better than the rest of the world, which is call out some of the most pervasive lies that entrepreneurs are told. Myths that sound motivating. They sound like good logical advice, but they actually lead to burnout, to bad decisions, and, in our experience, unnecessary failure. So if you have ever sat there feeling like you are doing everything right, but you're still struggling, it still feels like it's all coming out wrong, you want to keep listening. So Gwen, what we were talking about, I'm super excited. Today's a little bit more of a casual outline where we're just going to kind of go back and forth. But what excites me most about the myths that we're talking about today is because they're annoying, yes, but they're actually harmful. And you have seen business owners driven to tears to really feeling like they are horrible and they had no business being in business to begin with because of their failures. And more often than not, like you would have seen that coming had you known them sooner. So what I'm hoping you can do is like just sort of set the stage for why these particular myths that we're going to talk about today are so problematic.
So the thing is it is so pervasive. These ideas are so pervasive, we believe them to be true, right? And so we don't question them. And because we don't question them, then we use them as truths. And then using them as truths, we make decisions based on that assumption that they're true. And often those are bad assumptions. And it leads us down paths that can be okay because, any of these types of things that are so pervasive, there is elements of truth to them. But back to, yes, once again, context matters, right? It depends on the context. And when we follow them blindly, which is really where the issue is, when we follow them blindly, that is us going blindly down a path, which may or may not be anywhere close to where we want to go, and often is not in alignment with who we are and what we're actually trying to do and or build.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you said that. So I want to kind of pull at that because what I was going to ask, my follow-up question was going to be like, if these are myths, if these are so bad, it's like, why do they continue to persist? But you answered that as well. And I would almost label this all as they're sacred cows that give spoiled milk, right? They are so commonly touted as truths that even the people who do them and have them not come out to be successful, right? See how bad they were, are afraid to say anything because they think they're the only person who failed at it.
Well, and part of the issue also is they often started with someone who is highly successful that everyone respects. Because that was true for them.
Right.
Right.
Okay. let's start with the first myth. Because
Okay.
I want to spend some time on these, and that means we have no time to waste with
Okay,
pleasantries here, my friend. Trading time for money is bad business. So here's the lie I hear. In fact, somebody said these exact words to me this week.
Right,
which
we
is
talked about it yesterday, which is how we
Yeah.
said, oh, we need to do a podcast episode
Right.
on this.
You need passive income or you're not a real entrepreneur.
Okay, not that passive income isn't good, not saying that at all. But the first thing is very little passive income is truly passive. We got to start there. That's like a whole nother myth because there's this belief of like, you know, we just set it and truly forget it and nothing has to be done. Well, that's almost never true. Passive income really is I sit and mail and money just shows up. I don't have to pay anyone to monitor the thing. I don't have to.
Right. My favorite quote is entrepreneurship is the only business where you work 125 hours a week to make money while you sleep.
Right. Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's the first piece of it. But the real issue is this whole trading time for money. We are always trading time for money.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how much money. And so where a lot of people get caught is, are people seeing you at a rate that isn't appropriate for the value that you're actually providing? But it's not that you're not trading time for money, but how much is the value of the work that you're providing? So trading time for money can be at $20 an hour, but trading time for money can also be at $500 an hour. And trading time for money can also be at $10,000 an hour. But in all of those cases, we still, in fact, are trading time for money, different amounts of money.
Right.
But we're trading time for money. And so the problem is when people start saying, I don't want to trade time for money, it's like, is the work you're actually doing so brief, but with such huge value that we can't let them know how much time it took? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I've got a friend, client who actually has moments, let me say that, not all the time, moments where she can not trade time for money. She has such an incredible depth of very niche, highly valuable knowledge that she can actually say something that may be a 15 or 30-minute conversation that could save an organization tens of millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's really not trading time for money. That's trading wisdom for money, right? And often if they come up with a question, she'll wait a day to respond just so they think that she had to think about it. But she knows that she could have answered it right then, right there. But she also needs for them to value her wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not her business model.
Right.
She also does things that are more typical consulting where they are trading time for money. I'm spending an hour working with you and you're going to pay me for that hour. Now, they are not paying her $20 an hour for that hour.
Right.
You know, be cut back to there's deep experience and wisdom. But this whole belief of we can't trade time for money. The problem is we generally aren't good about understanding how to scope, how to stay in scope, how to set boundaries. And so we've used this as the excuse for not trading time for money. I'm just going to charge you for the project. Well, you're still got a certain number of hours. I don't look at a project and say, I'm going to charge you $100,000 for that. And say in my, you know, just because it's a random amount of money, we're actually looking at it and saying, okay, well, it's going to take me 100 hours and I want to get paid $1,000 an hour ish. And it may not be 100, it may be 80, but it may be 90, but it may be 200, you know, 120, but I'm going to charge you 100,000. I think 100,000 makes sense. That we're still looking at the time and we're still putting time into the project. So it's how much money are we making for the time? And when we start looking at as a project, most folks actually lose money because they're not good at about managing scope creep.
So let's pause here for a second because I feel like you're talking about a lot of different ways that people trade time for money, and it can easily get conflated in people's minds. So when we hear don't trade time for money, we usually hear don't trade time for money as a justification for project-based pricing over hourly-based pricing. That's one instance, and that's what you were talking about just now. We also hear it as an argument for what they call leveraged offer. So that would be a working with groups, having a group program instead of working with people one-on-one, or having a course instead of working with people one-on-one or even having a group, right? And some courses can be live delivery, some courses can be DIY, but the idea is you build out the course, right? And then people buy the course whenever they buy the course, they go through the course whenever they go through the course, and you are making profit on that regardless of whether you're showing up for live delivery or not, right? So there's all these different ways that we trade time for money. And kind of one of the points that I think is really important to make that is true in all of those instances is not only are you always trading time for money. Now there is, I think it is important to be fair that sometimes we're not necessarily trading our time for the money, right? Sometimes we're trading somebody else's time for the money, right? We're trading our customer service provider, right? We're trading their time because they're the ones answering the emails back and forth, or maybe we have a coaching team under us. Maybe we have a sales team, whatever, right?
But hopefully we're still paying them. So.
Hopefully we're still paying them, right? So we are trading their time for the money. We still may be making a higher profit. Obviously, I can go sip margaritas on the beach if I want while my team is working. So that could make me feel like I'm not trading time for money, but I am because I'm paying my team to deliver. The other piece is when we talk about not trading time for money, here's what gets my goat. Gets my goat. See, I have to be like using like old school imagery here. But it's when we act like the course just appeared out of nowhere. I'm going to say this specifically for a course, right? The course just appeared out of nowhere, like it was downloaded to my brain from the universe. It is instantly worth $1,000 and everybody is going to come clamoring for my $1,000 course that was downloaded from my brain. We discount the years of knowledge, education, experience, service delivery that we had to go through in order to amass the knowledge that actually could make up a fulfilling course, a valuable course. And then once that course is created and out there in the world, right, whether it's video, not video, doesn't matter, there's still time and energy that has to go into selling it, right? Because nobody is born knowing your course exists. So you've got email marketing and sales pages and social media and whatever else, maybe Facebook ads or whatever. But there is time and money associated with those activities too. And again,
as
just
well
because, go ahead.
Actual creation of the course.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So, just because you put the time in 2019 and you're getting paid on it in 2025 does not mean to some degree you're not charging or you're not trading time for money.
Well, and I think the bigger piece is you may not be trading your time anymore, but most likely somebody is trading time for it. And so, yes, can we create leverage things? We absolutely can. But it isn't magic. And most of the time when I hear people saying, well, I don't want to trade time for money, they really are looking at what I don't want to actually own is how much time it's taking for the money that I'm getting.
Right. And it's, I don't want to feel resentful. I don't want to feel like I haven't gotten a raise in 5 years. I mean, there's all these reasons. I do want to move on to our second point because I feel like, we got about 10 minutes per myth max here. But the second point allows me to use an example that also points to the first point. So this is when you and me first started working together. And the second myth is growth is always good, just so you can start preparing for that, Gwen. The lie is if you're not growing, you're dying. And when I first started working with you, you let me sit in on a coaching call with a client who had hired you because she was sitting at mid 6 figures and she just couldn't hit 7. And she was trying to hit 7 and she'd been working with some other people to help her hit 7. And it was kind of like everybody's like, we've given you our best and, it's just not good enough. And in the course of the conversation, what you helped her to appreciate is she could totally hit 7 figures, but hitting 7 figures would require her to pay herself less. Back to the trading time for money, she could totally run a 7-figure business, but it would mean paying other people to do some of the stuff that she was doing at the mid 6 figures because her business was very satisfying at mid 6 figures. She was working the number of hours she liked working. She was doing the kind of stuff she liked doing. She didn't want to work more to get to 7 figures. So the only answer then is if we want to bring in more revenue, serve more people, then we've got to hire people to do it. But hiring people to do the level of service at the level that she was used to providing wasn't going to cost $5 an hour. So she'd have to take a pay cut to herself in order to deliver this extra $500,000 in service. And she wasn't really interested in that. And you made the point that that's okay, right? Because it is perfectly okay to say, I'm happy being a solopreneur. I'm happy in the mid 6 figures if it means I get to pay myself $250 a year, right? This is fine to be I'm at capacity. I won't have space for a new client for 6 months or whatever. I would like you, because I imagine you weren't born with that realization. You weren't born with that knowledge. I also imagine, based on the look on this particular client's face when you shared that you're used to shocking people with such a statement, because she was shocked, but you were not. You're like, I know, but it's true. And she was, you could tell doing the math in her head, and she was going, yep, yeah, no, you're totally right. That is totally true. So let's talk about this growth is always good. Where does that come from? And how do you fight it?
Yeah, this is one of those places that I think we go with a nature analogy that if you're not growing, you're dying, that isn't actually a great example. So I'm looking out my window and I've got a tree out here that we got as a little tiny tree when we first bought this house, and it's now this big giant behemoth. And if it wasn't continuing to grow, would it be dying? Well, yes and no. Because what we think of as growing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But if you really look around, a lot of things, once they hit a size, they don't continue growing in that bigger sort of way. They do continue growing in this leaf dies and a new leaf comes in. And this leaf dies and a new leaf comes in. But it isn't, we grew 15 feet this year.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what we forget is that's also growth. This leaf died, this new leaf came in.
Right.
But we only assume size, bigger size. So the analogy of nature of, if you're not growing, you're dying is true, but we need to realize that the term growing can have a huge range of definition, which could be, I am getting new and different clients as other clients finish service. But that may not mean that my revenue changes at all. My revenue may stay steady, but it doesn't mean I'm not growing, because I'm still actually creating some new clients, and some new, and some clients are going away and some new clients are coming in. That can also be a growth, but we don't see that as growth. We only think of it as bigger, 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 bigger. And there's a point you can't get bigger. You just can't. Right? And we forget that as well, because most of the time we're talking with early stage entrepreneurs who will see that huge growth. I mean, as I look at this tree, we trim it way back because it's one of those really fast growing trees. And it got a huge amount of its height very, very, very quickly. But it's not growing at the same pace that it was now that we're 6 or 7 years in. Not that it's not still growing. It is still growing, but it's not growing at these big, giant numbers. And I think that's also part of the challenge that we have with these conversations is we're also saying, what is growth? Is growth 1% growth? Because 1% growth is still growth. But if we aren't seeing 50%, 100%, 200% growth, it's well, that's not really growth. Well, no, that's also growth. So how we define growth, I think, is the problem. And we're only defining it in one way most of the time. And when we're talking about it, people are thinking about it in that one way. And so if they aren't growing 100% year over year or whatever else, they're failing.
Right. Exactly. And so I feel like this myth can look a variety of ways. So, really what you're saying is that sustainable success actually comes from finding your sweet spot and staying there. And, if you're a service provider, that can look like being fully booked out at premium rates and not needing to have a team, like just being a solopreneur, shop of one, managing it all. For a retailer, it could simply be, you know what? I am going to make the most use of the square footage I have. I'm not going to look for a bigger shop. I'm not going to look to extend my hours. I'm not going to look to have more salespeople on the floor. I'm only going to have as many staff as I absolutely positively need, right? I'm only open as many hours as I absolutely positively have to. And I'm going to use the square footage I have as best as I can. And I'm not going to worry about the big box store down the way or what everybody else says I could have, should have, would have done. I'm just going to make the most of what I have. Because what we've seen, and this is what led to the conversation yesterday we were having, is that we see these business owners who are convinced that they have to grow, right? Mm-hmm. If they don't grow, they're dying. Then they grow beyond their capacity. And ultimately what happens is quality suffers, right? The quality of the delivery suffers. They're under way more stress and they can't perform their best. They can't make as good of decisions when they're under that much stress. And it always, always, always affects profitability. It may not affect revenue, but it always affects profitability.
Always affects profitability.
And I think sometimes the higher revenue hides the lower profitability for a long time if they're not paying attention to their numbers.
For sure. And I think the reason we get fixated on it is because revenue is an easy thing to track. Mm-hmm. Super, super easy. Everything else actually takes some math. But ask any business owner at any point in time about how much did you make last year, and they will know. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. If you ask them, what was your, what's what I call the nut? How much are your expenses every month? Most of them stare at me and go, I don't know. I have to look that up. That's actually a more important number, quite honestly, than your revenue number. I mean, it helps to then know your revenue number, but
yeah,
it's one of those things like, yeah, that's actually a really critical number to know. And the fact that you can't rattle that off is problematic. And so when we talk growth, back to we take the most simplistic answer of growth, which is bigger, 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 which isn't necessarily what growth has to be. And we say, what's the easiest number to look at? Bigger, 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 bigger. Revenue.
Yeah. Okay. Myth 3. Business owners must be present in day-to-day operations. Now, this, I think, oftentimes plays out in a brick and mortar environment, right? A retail environment, but it can play out in a practice. It can also play out in agencies, right? But this idea that if the owner isn't on the sales floor, isn't involved in client calls, isn't reviewing every detail, they're not really in charge.
And, this is one that back to it can be true because we've seen both sides of it, that we have I've seen environments where we have an absentee business owner that really is so absentee. It's like you are a stockholder, just like I can be a stockholder in Ford. So technically I'm a business owner of Ford.
But I really don't know how to put a car together.
I do. Even though I had a mechanic as a father, I probably know more than a lot of people, but no one wants me going to Ford and making decisions for them on their line and how to put cars together, right? So there can be a fully absentee version. And that can totally work. One of the, even in a retail shop, one of the shops that I worked at years and years ago had a fully absentee owner. She had a whole different other career that she loved and that she did all the time. And her manager was really functioning in the role that we think of as the owner role. But it's true. Sure, her fingerprint wasn't on anything.
Right.
Right. But there are a lot of environments where the owner can be still in charge without necessarily being involved in the day-to-day delivery. One of the things that I say a lot is are two things. If you're not going to be a fully 100% absentee owner that the owner has to be responsible for. It is the health of the business and it is the culture.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to be in the place doing the things all the time to manage that. But you do have to pay attention to it.
Right.
Right. And generally what I have noticed is so that you can't be fully absent, but it also doesn't mean that you have to be 100% present.
Right. Like there's an in-between.
There is an in-between for it. And most of our clients are falling in that in-between spot. They are not the only one doing the thing, but they also are not only showing up once every 3 months and peeking in the door. Right? They're helping make decisions, driving culture, doing some of those things. But it doesn't necessarily be the one who has to deliver the services. But you do need to make sure that the people who are delivering the services are the qualified people delivering the services. Back to the health of the business. Are you actually delivering the services and providing, the products that you want to be providing based on who you are and what you're bringing to the business, what your values and culture are that you're bringing?
And I would also add, there's a difference between being present and having your finger on the pulse of the business.
Absolutely.
Right. So this is something like we were having this question with having this conversation with one of your clients recently, where they were saying that they were less in the weeds than ever before, but much more informed about the details.
Yes.
So that's an example of they recognize, right, that their actual presence wasn't nearly as important as them being aware the details of what's going on. And I think what happens sometimes is business owners get burned out. And so they check out and they're both not physically present, but they're also not paying attention to anything. And what happens is they conflate those two different interactions with their business as being combined.
Right.
Right. So it's like, okay, if you don't want to be present, you don't have to be present, but you still have to be aware of what's happening and why it's happening. And like you said, you have good people in charge. You trust them. You can carry, they can carry things out. But part of that comes from a culture of accountability and, standards of presence and all of that sort of thing. All right. You ready for the fourth one, or do you want to see something more?
Just one other thing. The trick there really is understanding when the physical presence makes a difference. And are you actually holding your people accountable? When we had our LinkedIn Live with Nicole a couple of months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, one of the things that we came up with was you've got to transfer trust to your people, but you have to verify that they're doing the work.
Yeah, exactly. All right, the fourth one. So this is our final one, but this is a big one. So I'm going to hold us tightly to time on this one, Gwen.
Okay.
It is always better to be an entrepreneur than to have a job. And if you shut down your business to go get a job, you're, I don't know, a moron, you're dumb. Insert a word, right? Because nobody says anything nice about those people.
You're a failure. That's what everyone says in their head. And it is such the wrong word. If you were watching, you saw my horrible face as soon as she said, being an entrepreneur is way better than being an employee, all of those things. It's just different. Things that we've heard of recent are things like, oh, but when you're an employee, you're dependent on somebody else. And when you're an entrepreneur, you have complete control over everything. My first thought is, well, then you've obviously never actually been an entrepreneur if you're saying that. Because there are so many things that are always out of our control, whether we're an employee or an entrepreneur. I can't control who is going to buy my service. If I could, I would be 100% booked with all of the perfect clients, exactly who I wanted all the time. That is not within my control. They decide whether or not they want to work with me. Now, can I provide a good service? Yeah, absolutely. But I don't have control over that. I don't have control over what's going on in society and economics. I don't have control of what's going on in nature that may be affecting my supply chain. There are so many things I don't have control over. And I think that's where the lie gets started and told is, oh, but when you're working for somebody, they have all this control over you and you have none. That's actually not true at all. There can be environments, but that just means you're probably in a really, really bad work environment. Go find another job.
Well, I think what we hear, right, is like, okay, so when you have a job, right, you're paid to put in hours, usually, right? Not every job's like this, but most jobs, right? So, we're only going to pay you for 20 hours of work. We're only going to pay you for 40 hours of work. We're only going to pay you this much for that work, right? So you're not in control of your salary unless you have like open-ended overtime. You're not in control of how many hours a week you work, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is even as an entrepreneur, yes, you can set your rate, but you can't make anybody pay your rate.
No.
Right? And so just because you want to make $500 an hour working 20 hours a week does not mean anybody will pay you $500 an hour to work 20 hours a week. Right? Like, again, back to the control thing. And I have a friend who says, like, entrepreneurship is the only thing where everything falls under your responsibility. And when it all goes wrong, everything is your fault, but yet you have no control over any of it. Right? Because you can do everything right as an entrepreneur. And the other thing is this idea like, well, if you're an entrepreneur, you can't be fired. Well, that's not true. Like, as you said, right? Your clients can fire you at any point in time.
Clients can fire you all the time.
And this idea that you have complete control, well, you also have complete responsibility, right? So you don't have to worry about making payroll when you're an employee. You just have to worry about, is your check going to clear? And if your check doesn't clear, you can go work for somebody else.
Yep.
But that business owner...
And you have legal ramifications if your check doesn't clear right the first time.
Right. But we know a lot of business owners who skip paying themselves just to make sure payroll clears.
Yes. Absolutely.
And, what I think is really important, and because this is what we talked about yesterday, I want to make sure that we get this in the episode, is not everybody is wired for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship and the hard decisions that are required by entrepreneurship.
Right, because the piece that you've said, which is the most important piece, is, yes, you get to make all the choices, potentially, but yes, you have to own the outcomes of every single solitary one of those choices. And oh, by the way, if you have staff, you get to own those outcomes too, not just your choices. Mm-hmm. Because one of your choices was hiring that staff.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And or keeping that staff employed. And so this is the place where a lot of people say, oh, but I'll have time freedom and flexibility and this and that and the other thing, which could be true, but it doesn't mean that that's not possible in the job market, especially these days. I mean, things have changed so drastically, since COVID in 2020. You could have flexibility. Maybe you can, but you probably could. But we also, as entrepreneurs, have requirements that we have to fulfill, which means in some cases we have less flexibility than we did before. The phrase that used to be used a long time ago, you don't see it nearly as much now, is, as an entrepreneur, I just get to decide what are the 60, 80 hours of work I do each week.
Right.
As opposed to being told what the 60 hours are.
Right, exactly. As an entrepreneur, nobody gets mad at me for checking email while watching my kids practice. Right. Whereas if I had a job, they would say, like, you can't be checking email while you're watching your kids practice.
Or
that's in the office.
Or we expect you to check email while you're watching your kids practice, depending on what the work environment is. So, there are some choices there, but there's a lot of responsibility that goes with it. And that's the piece that nobody talks about. Every entrepreneur that I have worked with at some point, and I think I can actually say this across the board, needed to let someone go in some capacity, whether it was an employee, a vendor, a customer, there was somebody that they struggled in doing, often for months at their detriment.
Mm-hmm.
Because they weren't prepared for that hard part of entrepreneurship. They were prepared for the upside. They were prepared for, making decisions and being able to make choices about what we do and what we don't do and, some of these things. But when it came to some of the harder choices, which are often about people, it's like, I wasn't actually prepared for that. And some will say, oh, yeah, but if you're an employee, if you're high enough up, you still have to deal with that. Yeah, but usually you have someone else who will help you with it.
Right. Well, and here's what I think is true. Most of the time, employees make the same amount of money or more than an entrepreneur doing the same thing with less stress. I think that we all are doing the world a disservice if we don't at least acknowledge that there are benefits to employment, which include predictable income. In some cases, benefits, right? Medical coverage, dental coverage, vision coverage,
Right.
Not true everywhere, but, can be. Somebody else handling the parts of the business that you don't like, right? Because you don't take a job doing stuff you hate. So somebody else handling the operations, somebody else handling the accounting, the HR, somebody else handling the marketing, and clear boundaries, right? As a W-2 employee, there is a start time, there is an end time. There is some kind of agreement about nights and weekends and being on call. Those agreements are a lot more blurry for the entrepreneur.
They are. And I think where we get caught is we think we'll make more money as an entrepreneur. And yes, the people who are absolutely at the very, 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 very top of the income, hierarchy are all entrepreneurs. We can name them, right? It's the Bill Gates and the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musk and the Richard Bransons and the list goes on and on. We can list those. But that's also a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of all the entrepreneurs out there. And what we can find is a lot of times when you actually look, where do you make more money? You can make more money in the job than you can as an entrepreneur because you've got all the other expenses and all the other support things and all the things that it's not just about I'm charging X amount per hour, but it's all the other things that go with it. And, we had one of our long-term clients who decided to shut down her business and is functionally working at a job. And she's like, I work way less hours. I have way more control over my time and I'm making way more money than I ever did 10 years as an entrepreneur. Successful entrepreneur, right? Not someone who just failed, not someone who sucked at it, not someone who started, earlier this year and has given up already. No, I mean, this is someone who was successful and did it for a decade and is seeing that right now in this space and time, the job is a better answer.
Right. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to summarize our myths. Then I want to just offer a few tips for our listeners on how they can evaluate business advice critically. Because I know these aren't all the myths, right? These are just the ones that you and me encounter the most. And all of us needs to sharpen the skill of critically evaluating the advice that we're given. Because all advice, like you said, somewhere has a kernel of truth. There's a basis from which it comes from that is good, but not all of it applies to each of us. So the first myth that we addressed is trading time for money is bad business, or the idea that you need passive income to be a real entrepreneur. And the truth, as you said, Gwen, is everybody trades time for money in some way, even those who say they have passive income. And so consider this your permission that if hourly or project-based pricing works for you, go with it. It's legitimate. It is a perfectly fine way to do business. Second myth, growth is always good. If you're not growing, you're dying. The reality is that sustainable success comes from finding your sweet spot and just taking charge. Take up that space. It's okay. So if you can define success as sustainable and satisfying instead of bigger, you are like 5 steps ahead of a lot of other people who are just trudging along. The third myth was business owners must be present in day-to-day operations. If you're not on the sales floor, you're not on the client calls, then you're not a real business owner or you don't know what's really going on in your business. And Gwen, what you were saying is, yes, the most effective CEOs focus on strategy and vision, but they also stay plugged into what's going on, right? So you don't need to work in the business all the time. You definitely can work on the business, but you have to make sure that you have an awareness of what's going on in the business. The fourth one was entrepreneurship beats having a job, right? Being an employee does not mean you have settled. It does not mean you lack bravery, courage, or anything else. There is absolutely no shame in choosing stability over the instability of entrepreneurship. You can go back and forth between entrepreneurship and employment if that works for you. Sometimes it's a seasonal thing. There are some times in your life where you need medical coverage, right? And a W-2 job is the best way to get it for most of us. And there's other seasons in your life where you need more flexibility and you can handle income instability in order to get it. So choose your lane.
I was
Go ahead.
just talking about that.
Yeah.
With a client yesterday and saying, I have had at least 3 or 4 businesses that I have closed down and gone to a job at different times because it's what the season of my life required and what was going on in the world and all of the other things. It didn't mean that it was a failure. It was an opportunity to get a different set of skills and a different piece of knowledge. And then the next time I started the next business, I had added to my belt of tools. So one is not better than the other. They're just different.
Right. So now, Gwen, let's go into just briefly how to evaluate business advice critically. I'll do one, which is consider the source. Okay. I find that sometimes the least successful people are the ones who give me the loudest advice on what is required to be successful. So I consider the source. I also consider, if they are somebody who I view as successful, what's their business model? How close is how they are running their business to how I want to run my business? And then I really do think about how what they do that works for them may or may not work for me. Your turn.
The other things that I would always say, and they're very much in parallel to what you're saying. For me, obviously, context matters, man, because it's a big thing, and that really is to say what is true about what they're saying and what may not be true that maybe they don't even know is not true, right? Because it's hard for us to disengage with our own context to say the reason that I was able to do XYZ is because of these 18 things, some of which may have happened when I was 10 years old. And so how do we pull that together? That's really hard. That's right.
Yeah.
For us to be able to disengage that. So really thinking about what elements are true and what elements may or may not be true. One of the others that I always am a big fan of is bounce it against multiple other people's experiences or stories. Right? How often are we actually seeing this to be true? I'm going to pick on the, growing is better kind of thing. How many people have you seen grow and then fail? Well, okay, so that means growth isn't just the end all, right? So compare it against other stories and say, is this truth as a truth really true? Or can I find places where it's not true? If I can't, then that's also a place that I can say, so does that mean that truth would be true for me? Or is it possible that truth may not be true for me? And then I think the other is to actually understand all of these will start with an element of truth. So looking for where is that nugget? What is that piece in there that is true? And then how can I do my own extrapolation to take it to the point that it becomes true for me and my situation? And then the last piece is to realize that at any point in time, all of those answers may change.
Yes. Okay, so this brings us to a close. And so to kind of just wrap a bow around it all, what I would say is, let's call it the business advice industrial complex. Because I really feel like there are some people who think they are in the business of telling everybody else how they should run their businesses. Meanwhile, they really need to be sweeping their side of the street. But this business advice industrial complex loves to sell us on the myths that create urgency, that give us a fear of missing out, and that force us to add unnecessary complexity to our businesses. And the truth is so much simpler, right? Which is, to your point about context matters, success looks different for everyone. The right way to run your business is the way that aligns with your values, your capacity, your definition of fulfillment. My definition of fulfillment is not the same as Gwen's, right? Gwen's is not the same as me. And I bet our definitions are way different than you who is listening right now. You don't have to follow every piece of conventional wisdom. In fact, what I love about Gwen is she always says, best practice is actually just common practice. It's not best for everybody. And questioning the advice you get might actually be the best thing that you could be doing as a business owner for the health and sustainability of your own business. Now, if this feels over your head, if this feels hard, if you're confused because you're like, oh, I feel like I'm trying to decide between two viable decisions, get some help, get some advice. We would love to talk to you. You can have a call with Gwen. All you have to do is go to everydayeffectiveness.com/clarity. You'll get right onto Gwen's calendar. You guys can chit chat about it. It's not a sales call. It's a true conversation, but you can figure out in that conversation what success really would look like for you versus what everybody is blathering on and on and on about. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tonya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallyWant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.